apparently some people have said that the slip road that gives anybody coming towards the tunnel an option of either going through the tunnel or taking the slip road, that particular slip road, apparently, according to some people that saw this, was actually blocked by a motorbike. Do you want to elaborate on that?
It's definitely acknowledged in Lord Stephen's report as well that there was a motorbike parked broadside across the slip road off of the road, as you say. So Omri Paul was unable to
he had no
take
choice.
that. No, he had no choice but to go through the tunnel. In order to get back to Dodie's apartment, he needed to take that slip road off. So it wasn't just an option; it was a necessary one. He should have taken that. Given the fact that he'd gone this wrong way, as it were, the way back to Dodie's apartment was to take this slip road off of the road he was on. But he couldn't. Now, what Lord Stephen says is that Omri Paul was going too fast anyway, so that's why he didn't take it, even though the report does acknowledge that this motorbike was parked broadside across there, blocking his way. And it's not true to say Omri Paul was going too fast. The reason he sped up and carried on through the tunnel is precisely because this motorbike was blocking his path off of the road.
Now, am I right in saying that there were no witnesses at all to the actual moment when the Mercedes smashed into the pillar?
Aside from those who caused the crash, there were no witnesses at all. No, there's a fair number of witnesses to events immediately after and over the first few minutes after the crash, but there were no public witnesses to the crash itself.
But there are certainly witnesses who saw what was going on at the mouth, the entrance to the tunnel.
Yeah.
One of those is a gentleman called Mr. Hunter.
No, well, Gary Hunter was staying in a hotel kind of overlooking the exit route from the tunnel. He couldn't quite see the tunnel from his bedroom window, but what he did see was immediately after the crash. He heard two explosions in the tunnel. He was interested. He looked out of his window, couldn't quite see the tunnel from his window, but what he did see a few seconds later was a small Fiat Uno type car. It was very dark, remember, for him, and he was looking down, but he saw a Fiat Uno type car followed bumper to bumper by a Mercedes, he said, speeding away from the tunnel as though they were really, really trying to get away from someone. This is a London lawyer. This is not someone who's just, making up stories. He was there.
Now, what I find so interesting about that is that there's a direct contradiction as far as the movements of that white Fiat Uno. Let's say it definitely was a white Fiat Uno, because there's one report of the white Fiat Uno virtually at a standstill, loitering at the entrance to the tunnel, and then there's Mr. Hunter saying that after the crash, and obviously those explosions that he heard, I would imagine are the amplified sounds in a closed-in space of the car going to the pillar. And it seems that the Uno was loitering almost at a standstill at the entrance, and then just a few seconds later it was seen speeding off.
Indeed, yeah.
And I am right in saying, aren't I, that neither the car nor the person driving that car has ever been positively
identified or traced. No, that's absolutely right. And also interestingly, moments before that the Fiat Uno was seen loitering at the entrance to the tunnel, it was seen by an off-duty police officer speeding towards the tunnel. So what had happened was the Fiat Uno had sped towards the tunnel at quite some speed, overtaking the off-duty police officer en route. A few moments later, as the off-duty police officer, David Laurent, approached the tunnel, he saw the same Fiat Uno that had come to what he called a virtual standstill at the tunnel, like you say, loitering at the entrance there. And then half a minute after the crash, Gary Hunter saw the same car speeding away from...
Now that's not normal driving, is it?
It's not normal driving, and when we interviewed Professor Murray Mackay, that's a precise phrase he used almost. He said there was some very abnormal driving that night with regard to the Fiat Uno itself, because you imagine if you're coming into the Almar tunnel, the crash tunnel, the Diana's Mercedes comes up behind you, it clips your your rear wing.
Yes,
You're in a
because
tiny
there
little
was
Fiat
paint.
Uno.
There's
Yep.
paint from
Paint
an Uno on the Mercedes.
on the Mercedes, so we know, and it's acknowledged in both the French and the British reports that the Mercedes clipped the Uno on the way in. You're hit by a ton of speeding Mercedes.
4 tons of
Okay,
speeding.
4 tons of speeding Mercedes in a little tin can Fiat Uno. 2 seconds later, that Mercedes crashes full on into a pillar in front of you, spins around 180 degrees in front of you, and you have the presence of mind not to make any kind of correction manoeuvre that would leave a skid mark on the road. You wouldn't put your foot on the brakes. You just carry on. This is the Uno driver. There were no tyre marks or skid marks made by the Fiat Uno.
And then
at
Mr.
all.
Hunter
And yet
sees that car
speeding away from the tunnel about a half a minute later.
Now, would you say that, you know, judging on all the other things that have come forward and us putting this incident ball together, that would it be likely that perhaps the person who was remotely controlling the Mercedes, if indeed the Boston brakes method was being used, might likely have been sitting in that white Fiat Uno?
I think that is almost definitely the case, yeah, I would say so.
And no members of the public actually saw the impact of the Mercedes hit the pillar?
No. No one's come forward to say so.
But the person inside the Fiat Uno would most certainly have had the best view of that incident.
Absolutely, because it happened right in front of his eyes.
It is absolute black and white, horrendous murder.
We turn our attention to some interesting characters that just happened to be either stationed or just happened by chance to be in Paris that night.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware, there were some people with connections to the British establishment in terms of MI5 or MI6, and they were in Paris that night. Do you want to just give us a little list of all these interesting characters that all of a sudden seemed to be in Paris the same night that Diana was killed?
Well, we certainly know that 2 characters called Richard Spearman and Nicholas Langman were in Paris that night at the British Embassy. We now know for sure. There were always kind of speculations that they were MI6 officers. We now know for certain they were MI6 officers. In fact, Richard Spearman was formerly private secretary to the chief of MI6, so he was a very senior MI6 officer at the embassy that night.
So one of Britain's most senior MI6 officers was at the British Embassy the night that Diana died.
Indeed, yeah.
Am I right in also saying that there were extremely senior French officials actually in the tunnel?
Yes, there were. Yeah, we know that the chief of police was there. Some very, very senior French officials arrived at the tunnel.
And we presume that they were called because they were told a VIP has crashed,
Yeah,
and
I
they
think
rushed
so.
to the scene.
Yeah.
Well, Paris is full of VIPs. Some of the world's most famous people actually permanently reside in Paris. So I can only presume that they were told specifically, this is Princess Diana.
Yeah, I would think so.
She's a British royal and it's a very serious situation, so they went to the tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
But am I right in saying that at the British Embassy, which has a special communications room like all embassies do, there was a person that requested one of the staff to leave the communications room.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure, yeah. There was, according to the wireless operator who was in the communications room that night, who reported that everything was abuzz because they knew perfectly well Diana was there, obviously, even though in the official report now we're told that the British Embassy had no knowledge of Diana's presence in Paris until after the accident, which is complete nonsense, of course. But yes, this wireless operator says that 2 old Etonian type, very well-spoken English characters burst into the communications room and told everybody to get out at about just before Diana and Dodie left the Ritz. They were told to get out. And this particular wireless operator named one of those characters as Lord Fellows, who is the husband of Diana's sister, formerly Sir Robert Fellows, who is the husband of Diana's sister, Lady Jane Fellows, and at the time of Diana's death, he was the Queen's private secretary. So what he was doing at the British Embassy, clearing out the communications room, I don't know.
Yes.
It must be said at this point, Lord Fellows has been questioned on that, and he's denied, obviously, that he was there. But nonetheless, this person's testimony is that he was there, and you have to ask yourself why someone would make up such a story.
Yes. Or, to give it the situation the benefit of the doubt, it could be a case of complete mistaken identity.
Could be, or it could be the case that Lord Fellows got his weekends wrong because he said he was in Norfolk that weekend. Who knows?
James Danson, a member of the French paparazzi, apparently a man who's made quite a lot of money from selling photographs of VIPs and royalty to various magazines and newspapers. We've made a little list here. He's a well-known royal paparazzo and alleged part-time MI6 agent. James and Danson owned a Fiat Uno identical to the one involved in the crash. He confessed, or some people say he boasted, to some of his friends that he was actually in the tunnel when the crash happened, and that he took some highly compromising photographs of the crashed Mercedes.
Indeed, yeah. We know indeed that he'd spent the summer photographing Diana and Dodi anyway, specifically.
And that was on the yacht
He'd been on the Jonical, he'd been to Corsica, he'd been in the south of France, he'd been all over just photographing Diana and Dodi, and he was actually compiling a photographic record that he was planning to turn into a book later on.
He did actually, this is really for sure, he did own a Fiat Uno.
He definitely owned a Fiat Uno, a white Fiat Uno that forensically matched the Fiat Uno that was involved in the crash.
And he boasted to his friends that he was in the tunnel.
He did, but he said he was on his motorbike, which is what he normally did.
See.
But that's interesting because there are several motorbikes seen in the tunnel as well.
Now this gentleman is dead, isn't he? What
he is dead, yeah.
Happened to him shortly after all this happened? I think within 2 years or 3 years.
Yeah, indeed. He was found in his burnt out BMW in a secluded wood 400 miles from where he was supposed to be that day, with a bullet hole in his head.
And
the car was locked from the outside. They've never found the keys, and the verdict, of course, was suicide. So, and then, of course, just a few days after his death was made public, the SIPA press agency in Paris was broken into by a gang of 3 armed men.
This is a press agency that receives photos from paparazzi.
Yep, and they shot the security guard and stole James Anderson's photographic archive.
And did that include the photos that he'd taken prior to?
Well, we don't know because the photographs were never recovered.
Oh, I see.
But one must assume that that's quite possible, yeah.
I mean, he boasted to his friends that he had some photographs of the actual crash.
Of the actual crash and of who was actually in the tunnel immediately after the crash.
And then the agency that he supplied photos to was broken into and their archives were stolen.
Indeed. In fact, on the very day he died in his burnt out car in the south of France, he was supposed to be at a meeting at the SIPA press agency that day, where the person he was meeting was supposed to be buying photographs from him.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that he'd boasted or that he'd written into his diary, whether this is true or not, but it is said that he made a an entry in his diary saying that he had actually spent some time on board the Jonicle.
That's right, yeah.
Taking photographs, one presumes, and that this had been an arrangement mutually agreed between himself and Diana.
That's right, yeah. I mean, he was very close to the royals. He'd taken a lot of photographs of the royals. He took what's now a very, very famous photograph, for example, of Prince Charles kissing the royal nanny, Tiggy Leg Bork, that fetched him about £100,000 for that photograph alone, that one alone. So this is some of the evidence that's thrown into the pot to suggest the fact that he was working closely with the royals, and because he was, year after year after year, he was able to pass information back to his MI6 handlers on their whereabouts, their movements, etc., etc. What we know is he was almost certainly in the tunnel. What we know is he witnessed the crash, he took photos of the crash, he took photos of whoever was there immediately after the crash. He must have seen that Fiat Uno, whether he was driving it or not. He must have seen who was on the motorbike that overtook the Mercedes immediately before it crashed. So he had some very compromising photographs. Whether or not he was a part-time informant, paid informant for MI6, that's likely. But whether he was actually a hired assassin and actually driving that car, I don't think so. I don't think that was his car. I don't think it needed to be his car. You know, he's just someone that I think a lot of focus has been...
Do you think that James Danson's reputation is being used, setting him up as a scapegoat?
Yeah, I would say that's a very likely scenario.
Okay,
yeah.
That's very interesting. Do you think that Diana, in really going against the military-industrial complex, as it's known in America, would provide a motive strong enough for certain people to try and kill her, to stop her from continuing this landmine campaign?
I think certainly, yeah. I think that certainly a motive enough to involve, say for example, the CIA in what I believe was already an MI6 plot to kill her. But yeah, I mean the very fact that she alone persuaded then President Clinton to effectively U-turn on US defence policy and agree to sign the Landmines Treaty. I mean, she persuaded President Clinton to sign the Landmines Treaty on her own. And people look at landmines and say, well, you know, landmines, but you know, the amount of landmines in the world, 200 million deployed around the world, another 200 million stockpiled, ready for use. She was also, there was also talk of other mines, anti-tank mines coming into the whole equation, not to mention the airborne mines, the cluster bombs that have been used in both Gulf, you know, the Gulf War
yes.
to begin with, and now the Iraq War. We're talking billions and billions of dollars. And what next? What next? If she could persuade the President of the United States to, you know, defy the American defence industry, then what else, you know, what else was she capable of? So
well,
yeah, I think that was enough to interest the CIA.
Yes.
Because the note that Diana wrote, everyone assumed at the time when that note was published that she was referring to Camilla when she said that her husband was planning an accident in her car in order to make the path clear for him to marry. Everyone put Camilla on the end of that note in their minds. But actually the woman Diana was referring to was Tiggy Leg Bork. And Diana was, this is in this note and in the note she lodged with her lawyer, Tiggy Leg Bork is named. And Diana's fear was that both herself and Camilla were on the government hit list in order to make the path clear for Charles to marry Tiggy Leg Bork. Now, just one small instance there that is very interesting is, 10 years ago now, I was told very specifically that there had been an assassination attempt on Camilla Parker Bowles. And interestingly enough, that assassination attempt had taken the form of a road traffic accident. Camilla had survived a near fatal car crash just about 6 weeks before Diana's own car crash claimed her life. So there's something in what Diana was fearing there. There's more to this note than meets the eye immediately, even though it's very interesting anyway. But there's more to it even than that. I've spoken to a lot of sources in my investigation, and my initial sources, my initial MI5 source and another source I was introduced to by that person, told me very clearly that Diana's death was the result of the failure to assassinate Camilla Parker Bowles.
It's now transpired that people that Diana presumably considered as being very, very close friends have very, very strong connections to MI5 and MI6. One of those people is Rosa Monckton. Can you tell us about Rosa Monckton?
Well, she's a very interesting character, Rosa Monckton. Yeah, I mean, she kind of somehow became Diana's probably her most, well, certainly publicly speaking, her closest confidant, you know, in the public eye. And I think she did get very close to her. But what's interesting with regard to her connections to the intelligence community is that, well, the Monktons really are pretty much a British spy family. That's pretty well known. Rosa's grandfather was pretty much a government agent. He was advisor and confidant to Edward VIII during the abdication crisis, keeping an eye on the errant king. Rosa's brother, Anthony Monckton, has recently been outed as a very senior MI6 officer. According to Mohammed Al-Fayed, Rosa's other brother, Christopher, is also a very senior MI6 officer. Rosa's husband, Dominic Lawson, editor of the Sunday Telegraph, has been accused in the press and in Parliament of providing cover for MI6 officers and having connections to MI6. So I think for Rosa to just plainly deny any connection at all to MI6, which she did in the Lord Stevens report, is a little difficult to swallow, really.
Yeah.
Well, of course, we know that this now was definitely written by Diana, because a second note has recently come to light, which was lodged with her lawyer at the time, which is pretty much a replica of that, with a lawyer called Lord Mishcon. Yeah. So we know that was what she was saying, and that she was fearful that she was going to die in an accident. Don't forget, of course, that we mustn't forget that she really, really believed that her former lover, Sergeant Barry Manicky, who was her bodyguard at one point,
This chap here, this is Barry Manicky,
yeah, that he was killed in a he was killed in a road traffic accident, but Diana was convinced that was an MI5 operation that killed him, and she was also always fearful of dying in a similar way, as this note shows. And like you say, it's chillingly prognostic. There are a few things really, but I guess most notably is the fact that this Mercedes was stolen prior to the accident. Now,
do you know how
it was stolen? Yeah, well, it was stolen by an armed gang of three. At gunpoint, which is, perhaps if you're in the trade of buying and selling stolen cars, then a Mercedes S280 is worth stealing. But this car was found a few days later with nothing missing, nothing wrong with it except the little microchip, effectively the car's computer that certainly controls the car's steering and brakes. Now, also on the night of the accident, we're told that, and this is official as well, according to the conclusion of Lord Stevens' Operation Paget report, that this car was the only available car. But we're told it was the only available car, the very car that had been stolen. Its EMS, electronic management system chip, taken out, and then the car returned. Who actually repaired that car? Who replaced that chip? We still don't know.
So there is a definite possibility then that this technique that had been developed, some years previously by the SAS might very well be the exact way that this Mercedes was controlled, by taking that chip on this, staged gunpoint raid on the car.
Absolutely,
and taking it away. In that period, we see the chip being replaced, which could be a modified chip according to specifications of the SAS or
That's exactly what it would have been.
intelligence.
According to, I also personally interviewed a former SAS sergeant called Dave Cornish, and he looked at this, and I put this theory to him, and he said, absolutely, that is exactly how it would have been done. They would have stolen the car, taken one chip out, replaced it with another, no one would have known, and that's exactly how it would have been done, according to Dave Cornish, Sergeant David Cornish.
Now, what happened to the offer from Mercedes-Benz engineers?
Yeah, they were refused permission to go anywhere near the wreck.
Who refused them?
The French authorities. Yeah, they were refused permission. So
because, Mercedes are renowned as one of the world's greatest
Absolutely.
car manufacturers.
Absolutely.
The car itself is the top of the range S-Class. Like you say, a 500 and a 600 is the top of the S-Class range. This is one of the best cars in the world, built by a professional company that was offering, I presume, for free, the expertise of
its own engineers, yeah, and they were refused permission.
Do you think, it's fair to speculate that the reason that Mercedes-Benz have never been allowed access to the crash is because they know that car inside out? Obviously, they are the company that designed it and manufactured it, and that there had been these modifications, and that Mercedes-Benz are deliberately being kept away from it because probably one of their engineers would pick up on something that was not put in that car at the time when it was manufactured in the factory.
Absolutely. And a very similar scenario, according to Sir Ranulph Fiennes again, with Sir Peter Horsley incident. That's exactly what happened in that situation as well. The police were not allowed near that car until, according to Sir Ranulph Fiennes, this is not conspiracy theory, this is Sir Ranulph Fiennes saying this, the team that carried out the assassination made sure that their men got to the car before the police were able to examine it in a very similar way to this. You would expect that Mercedes-Benz engineers would have been allowed to come in and give their opinion on the condition of the car, but they weren't allowed to.